Council meeting is called to order for May 5th. You'll rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, has everyone had a chance to look over the April 16th meeting minutes? If so, I'll ask for a motion to approve.
I move we approve minutes from April 16th.
Second it.
Motion from Mike, second from Troy. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. All right, any additional items for this evening's agenda? Hearing none, I'll ask for approval of the agenda.
Motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Second.
Motion from Rick, second from Mike. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. Guests in open forum. Our first under guests in open forum will be the 2018 annual audit presentation by Bergen KDV. Welcome.
Well, good evening. Thank you for giving me some time tonight to go over the results of our audit. And you did receive 2 booklets, but we're not going to page through those. I put the highlights in this PowerPoint presentation for you.
Right.
So to start out, I want to talk about the independent auditor's report. As auditors, first and foremost, it's our responsibility to issue an opinion on your financial statements. Those financial statements are management's responsibility. We test transactions, we verify balances, and based on that, we're issuing an unmodified opinion on your financial statements, which is the best opinion that you can receive, a clean opinion, if you will. Basically indicates that everything is fairly stated in all material respects based on the results of our audit. In addition to that opinion letter, we have several other reports that we issue. First of all, because of some of the funding that you receive, we follow what are called government auditing standards. So we're taking a little bit of a closer look at your internal controls and also compliance with laws, regulations, contracts, and grants. And based on that, we did have 2 internal control findings this year. The first one was prior period adjustments. So this happens very commonly when you switch auditors, new sets of eyes looking at things a little bit differently. So we made some adjustments. First of all, to the general fund, there was an accounts receivable that wasn't recorded at the end of 2017, so we corrected that. In the community center fund, there was some unearned revenue based on fees that overlap over year end, so we recorded that unearned revenue. And then finally in the sewer fund, we recorded a receivable about $5.6 million related to the addition that you put on related to Liberty Paper. So they're contributing to the bond payment, so we recorded that as a long-term receivable to offset the long-term bond payable. So those 3 things we corrected. And then the second finding is a lack of segregation of accounting duties. This is very typical in the city the size of Becker, but you had some things playing into it this year. First of all, there was some gaps in the staffing throughout the year based on what you had last year at the end of the year and what you had during the year this year. And then also there are some significant things that have to do with the fire department, some overlapping duties related to the transactions there. So all things that the city is working on, and some of the things have already been corrected at the city level. So we'll reevaluate that one next year if we're back to see if it should still be in writing at that point. And then our final official letter is a report on Minnesota legal compliance. So on an annual basis, the Office of the State Auditor issues a checklist for us to complete. It covers 7 broad categories of legal compliance. And based on the completion of that checklist, we did have 3 findings this year. The first one is a lack of council travel policy. So there's some specific guidelines in Minnesota statute that require that policy. So we're just recommending that you implement and approve that. The second one had to do with the disbursement of the fire state aid that is required to be paid back to the Fire Relief Association within 30 days of receipt, and the payment happened after those 30 days. And then finally, timely payment of bills, and this had to do with bills for the fire department not being received at the city office to be paid in a timely manner. So we're just recommending that that be monitored a little bit closer, and I think that that's something that's also being worked on and corrected already. And then finally, we issue a communications letter, and in there, are several pages that are titled Required Communication. So these are things that our standards require to put in writing to all of you. It would be our tool if we had any difficulties or disagreements or anything unusual that we uncovered. And I'm happy to report we had none of that, so really just standard boilerplate language in those several pages. And then finally in there is some financial analysis, and that's what I'm going to spend most of my time tonight on. Questions on any of those reports? All right, then we'll get into the fun stuff, the numbers. The first chart that you see takes a look at the general fund and the fund balance over the last 5 years. And all these charts will present a 5-year perspective, and we're really going to key in on variances between 2017 and 2018. So overall, fund balance in the general fund increased about $412,000. Revenues did exceed expenditures, and then also we had that prior period adjustment for the receivable that was recorded at year end. Both of those pieces coming into play there. Digging into the revenues a little bit, the first chart on the revenues that we have is the by source and dollar amount. So overall, revenues were up about $287,000 or 8.1% for the year. The largest increase was in taxes and assessments, just based on an increase in the levy for the city. Intergovernmental revenues were up about $41,000, and that had to do with primarily an increase in the fire aid that is passed through to the Fire Relief Association. And then finally, licenses and permits up about $42,000, just with increased building permits and development within the city for 2018. Other sources pretty consistent with the prior year. Taking a look at those same numbers in a little bit different perspective, this is a percentage of a total on those same sources, and you can see by far and consistently, taxes and assessments are your largest funding source for the general fund. And overall, even if you look into the smaller categories, very consistent sources for the last 5 years. And then finally, one last look at the general fund revenues on a budget to actual perspective. So overall, your revenues were about $252,000 or 7.1% over budget, so conservative budgeting. And primarily in the areas of licenses and permits and intergovernmental revenues, those were both over budget, licenses and permits by $94,000 and intergovernmental by $107,000. Again, conservative budgeting based on some of those things that can fluctuate from year to year. Switching gears then to the expenditures, you can see an overall upward trend in your expenditures in the general fund for the 5 years that we're looking at. And if we just key into 2017 versus 2018, up about 17%. It had some significant changes during the year. And the biggest increase comes in your general government category. That was up about $322,000. You had contracted planning services this year, moved to an external company for 2018, increased engineering fees with some of the things that you have going on in the city, and then finally an organizational structure study that was completed in 2018. So all of those coming into play in the general government category. Public safety also up about $100,000 related to the new contract, so wage increases there. Public works, also wage increases in that category, and additional repairs and maintenance if you compare that to 2017. And then finally, offsetting those increases, you'll see a decrease in the very bottom category, the capital outlay, and that just had to do with most of the capital expenditures coming out of your revolving capital project fund this year. So if we take those expenditures and convert them to percentages of a total, that's what you'll see on this chart. You can see that overall, pretty consistent. And when you compare 17 to 18, you'll see that jump in the general government for all the reasons that we talked about on the previous page. And general government, public safety, and public works all making up about 30% of the general fund for the last 5 years. And then one final chart for the general fund expenditures, again, budget to actual. Overall, expenditures pretty close to budgeted amounts, under about $90,000 or 2.5%. If you look at the categories, there are some fluctuations there. First of all, general government was over budget actually, and that had to do with that organizational structure not being included in the budgeted amounts. And then the two offsets there, the public safety and public works coming in under budget. Basically, conservative budgeting for the contract, the new contract for public safety, and lower fuel costs for public works, the main drivers in those two categories. Any questions on the general fund? All right, then moving to your enterprise funds, we have one chart for each fund. First of all, water fund, and I think the good news on this chart is that for the first time in 5 years, you did have operating revenues. And we present operating income in two ways. First of all, with depreciation, subtracted out, and then also without. Depreciation, as you know, is a non-cash expenditure, using up of your assets over their useful life. So it doesn't really drive cash flow. So that's why we like to present it both ways. It's really a local decision whether you're going to cover all of that depreciation with your current fees. So when we look at the drivers of that operating income, your revenues were pretty flat, almost even with 2017, but your operating expenses did decrease about $54,000. And I don't know if you remember, a couple years ago, we implemented GASB 68, or the pension standard, so we recorded a pretty significant pension liability on your books. And in 2018, that liability actually decreased. So that's the biggest driver in the change in your operating expenses in this fund. The sewer fund, a little bit of a different picture here. You had pretty consistent operating income, or operating revenues. Your operating expenses were up about $94,000. You had increases in professional service fees and supplies, and then also the utility costs related to the new part of the system that was added in 2018. So when you look at the overall operating income, it was a loss of $623,000, but the good news is if we subtract out that non-cash depreciation, you are showing an operating income for this fund. So you're saving some money for future capital needs. And then the last enterprise fund is the golf course fund. This fund did have increased operating revenues and expenses. Primarily, the driver was the open year-round for the restaurant in the fund for this year, for the first full year in 2018. But you are still seeing operating losses, both with and without depreciation. So for 2019, this fund will be presented in the governmental activities as a governmental fund, because enterprise funds are reserved for self-supporting operations, meant to be how a business operates. And the city has decided to support the golf course, so it will be moved into governmental activities. Questions on those funds? All right, then I just have one last chart with some interesting information about your tax levy and tax capacity. So if you look at this, the middle, the orange line there is your tax capacity rate, and you can see that's been pretty consistent over the 5 years. It did decrease a little bit in 2018, and that has to do with the fact that your tax capacity overall has been increasing. So you see a nice increase there, allowing for an increase in the levy without impacting the rate significantly. So good news for the taxpayers of the city of Becker. And that is what I have. So willing to take any questions, comments from you. If there's anything you'd like to talk about further, we certainly can do that.
Earlier in, you made a reference to the fire department bills.
Yes.
I'm not quite positive how that works. Do we pay those bills, or do the fire department pay them? So we weren't getting the bills in an orderly, okay.
Yeah, what happens is we just test a sample of disbursements, and there were several fire departments disbursements in there, and then state statute has a definite date by which they have to be paid, and those were outside of that requirement. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. Anyone else for guests in open forum? Seeing no one, we'll move on to committee reports. Budget and Finance.
Budget and Finance are, Nancy and I don't remember, it was another gal that was with us from KDV as well to present the preliminary of the report we just heard. That was our hour. We had discussion on that as well.
Golf.
We met on April 22nd. The HVAC system is almost done. The big AC units that are out front, they're gone. Would like to thank Lori Keller, big thanks. She used some of her city council money to buy a pump for hole 10. We're trying to fix the fountains. By doing that, The pump that's in 10 will go to 6, and the pump that's in 6 will go across the road to 7. So hopefully we can get everything, all the fountains working this year. The Saturday, the 20th, I believe it was, there was 244 players that played through. They're going to start filling the irrigation system May 1st. They're working on the audio improvement project. Hopefully it gets up and running. They have the first wedding on the 10th. They're thinking it'll be done on the 9th. We also interviewed 55 people for the food and beverage manager. They did offer the position to a young gentleman, and with the they're waiting on background check to move forward. And then everything's looking good out there. I don't know if you guys have tried it, but the new menu is out. There's a big buzz about that around town, so that's all I got.
Joint planning.
Joint planning, we had a couple items, a couple of policy updates, one related to home compost, kind of sizes, dimensions, just updating in the policy, and then another one relating to secondary requirements for, requirements for secondary buildings. So there was a lot of things that were, if you have multiple buildings, think in the township, if you had your main house and maybe say a large shed or something like that, so you would say the shed would be a secondary building. So just some updates to the policy regarding the secondary buildings. That was it.
Planning?
Planning,
Yeah, go ahead.
planning, so we, as you know, we've been starting, or we've been talking about it for quite a while, about looking at starting to go through the policy book, and we tackled Chapter 4, which was some of the other chapters have been distributed out to the various committees, but Chapter 4 was one that pretty much pertained to the Planning Commission. So we didn't have anything else on the agenda, and so we spent about an hour and a half going through that. So very riveting.
Very interesting.
But a lot of discussion. I mean, that's why we're doing it.
The only other committee, we had Public Works as well. And we reviewed the Industrial Park Feasibility Report, which we will see this evening, presentation from Randy. And then we also discussed the 2019 street projects. I was kind of excited to maybe see them on tonight's agenda, but they're not here. They're not quite ready. We did send them back. What has been proposed for 19 doesn't fit within our CIP for the year. So we did send the department back to kind of reallocate and give us some options in order to hit our CIP in order to fulfill that. And then also just a friendly reminder regarding Cleanup Day, or AKA Recycle Day, is now what it's termed, just because. Remember, GRE is closed. We can no longer take garbage, so it's now more recycling. It's your mattresses and tires and electronics is a little bit more recycle. So that is coming up on the 18th. So looking forward to that.
Looking for volunteers to help.
Yes, we could always use volunteers. we all take our turn up here doing it.
So it's your turn this year?
I'm there every year
Oh,
with a big smile on my face.
I suppose I can go over and run the front end loader for a little bit.
I think you're going to get the tires.
Oh,
I usually get the mattresses. So.
All right, any other committee reports that we missed? Or anyone wants to report on? No? Okay. Board, committee, and consultant reports. The Business Park Feasibility Report, just what we were talking about. Randy Sabart.
Good evening. So similar to KDV's presentation, I'm not going to go through the detail of the narrative of the book. We'll go through
But we spent like an hour and a half going through it at Public Works.
I don't want to bore the whole council again, so we'll touch base on some of the graphics, the slides in the report. So that's why we refer to this as kind of the feasibility report highlights. And so this first graphic that we're looking at is the study area that we focused on. And so this is similar to the future land use plan area that's in your comprehensive plan. So that purple area that you see is about 1,600 acres. And the shaded areas can you read that on your screen, the text on your screen, or is that too small?
Well, I can, but
I'm going to strain your eyes, I'm afraid.
it says Sherco 1 and Sherco 2.
Yes.
I want to
so
ask Mike.
Yeah.
those two areas, Sherco 1 and Sherco 2, you're going to see those boundaries on subsequent slides. But those are important because those are two of the parcels that XL Energy is actively marketing. So we'll come back to that. But the point here being that, and the focus of this study was primarily the water distribution system, so your water main pipes, hydrants, and the sanitary sewer collection system, so the sewer pipes. So it did not address, or the focus wasn't a facility plan in terms of expanding the wastewater plant or a water supply study in terms of how much elevated storage, water tank capacity that you need. So the focus really was water mains and sanitary sewer collection. So this next slide is a picture of the proposed water distribution system. And so one of the struggles when we're looking at planning for future areas is you have to make some assumptions and educated guesses on what's going to develop, where it's going to develop, how much capacity they're ultimately going to need. And so in this particular case, we had some indication with respect to a water need, for example, at the Sherco 2 site. And so that was our starting basis. But when we look at these types of comprehensive studies, we're using general values for what industrial property consumes for water or what it might generate for wastewater. So, and then furthermore, breaking this down so that you don't have this large well, it's large regardless, but larger capital expense to develop it all at one time. So we tried to look at how you can phase the improvements and grow as the property develops. In this particular case, though, the first developing area was the south side of the Sherco 2 parcel, so on the left-hand side of that exhibit. And in order to meet the water demands that first phase of Sherco 2 is looking, we had developed a computer model, actually expanded your existing computer model for the water distribution system. So that helps us analyze different scenarios, development scenarios and water demand scenarios. And so the blue line represents a trunk water main, and I'm hoping you can make out, it'll either say 12-inch WM or 16-inch WM. So those are the proposed diameters of this first phase of trunk water main improvement. So generally a 16-inch water main running along the south side of the study area in Sherco 2, and then towards the north side where we move back at Edgewood Street and First and along County Road 52, we're looking at a 12-inch diameter water main. You might see that you see the blue line is a slightly lighter weight or thickness where the proposed frontage road is going to be. The assumption that we made that with those improvements proposed to be built this year, that we're treating that as an existing water main. So we'll connect at the frontage road as well on County Road 8, and then down in the southeast corner at Industrial Boulevard. So the red little dots that you see are representing hydrants, our typical hydrant spacing. There isn't as much of a graphic to relay when the one exception when I mentioned to the focus area, we did take into account water supply, the water supply needs that this first phase of Sherco 2 development is looking for. And so this table 1 summarizes your existing well water supply capacity. The total capacity of the 4 wells that the city operates is 1,750 gallons per minute. When we look at planning for wells, one of the planning approaches is you take the largest well, or you assume the largest producing well is out of service. It goes down for whatever reason. So in this particular case, the largest producing well is a 750 gallon per minute well. If you look in the second from the right column, well number 4. So when we plan for well capacity, we take that well out of consideration. So that gets us down to what we call a firm capacity of 1,000 gallons per day. So that's our starting point. That bottom paragraph at the bottom of this slide summarizes what we're looking for, planning for water supply, accounting for the Sherco 2 site. And so we're looking for a total capacity of your water supply of 3 million gallons per day under maximum day conditions. So I point that out now. There isn't a graphic or a slide other than I want you to be aware that we're also planning for water supply expansion as part of this exercise. Next slide, we referred to it as the ultimate phase, or I could have said phase 2 or phase 3. When we look at serving that far northwest corner of our study area, so that area immediately south of Trunk Highway 10 and bordered by County Road 53 on the west side. So we'd have one more trunk water main extension, which would be a 12-inch trunk water main loop. So again, these improvements go in, or would potentially go in, as that property develops. And so that's why we call it an ultimate phase, is that we wouldn't propose to build that next year because there isn't going to be any customers connected to the pipe. So as that property within that triangular piece on the northwest side develops, that's when the city would contemplate this potential expansion. And because we don't have a crystal ball of knowing when that'll happen, we just want to refer to it as an ultimate expansion of the water distribution system.
Can I ask you a question about on this picture here? So the north, you get the 12-inch water main, it'd be the north, a little bit on the northernmost part here.
Mm-hmm.
Is that like a road, or what kind of boundary other than is that just a property boundary that goes along?
Some of them on the west side or the left side of that's following County Road 53
Mm-hmm.
right of way. The other boundaries are actually property lines. And so that's another point I should reinforce. These aren't hard lines on the paper in terms of development, since we don't know whether a 40-acre parcel will develop or a 400-acre parcel will develop. These are things that end up getting massaged once you actually get a site plan. So we know we'll need to loop a large water main at some point, but in 15 years or 20 years from now, if the need arises, they may look different than this. So good point not to necessarily get fixated on, in this case, the water main alignment. Water main's a lot easier for us to move around than gravity sanitary sewer is. So I'll move on to, actually the next slide refers to the wastewater collection system, sanitary sewer. And this one was much more challenging to plan from a phasing perspective. You may have heard me before when we talk about pump stations in particular. So these are facilities that collect wastewater. They have a mechanical pump that pressurizes the wastewater and delivers it under pressure to some other point, typically another gravity sewer, or in our case here, it actually will go directly to the wastewater plant. And so sizing pumping facilities can be challenging because you can actually make them too big. One, you don't want to necessarily have larger pumps in a pump station than are really needed to pump the flow. They're much more expensive, they consume more power. So we typically approach pump station design iteratively and try to change pumps as you need more capacity, for example. But the actual tankage, the tank that receives the wastewater, we try to do our best to try to size that as close to what you ultimately need and maybe partition it and grow into that capacity. So one point I wanted to reinforce is when it comes to pumping stations, you can make them too big and you can also make them too small. So we're doing our best to try to best fit them. In this graphic, what we're looking at, the triangles represent pump station locations. And so you'll see the red line, which is the pressurized force main, and the red triangle at the southwest corner of the Sherco 2 site. So we refer to that as the Sherco 2 pump station. Towards the center of the page, kind of the orange colored, you'll see a triangle. We're referring to that one as the Sherco 1 pump station. this will also be the pump station that will ultimately serve Northern Metals. And so that's really even though we're talking about this being phase one for the industrial park expansion, that's one that we'll actually be looking at implementing as part of the frontage road and Northern Metals utility service. Which is another reason why doing the study was critical, so that we didn't have to revisit this pump station size later after Northern Metals developed and or the Sherco 1 site developed, for example. So it was kind of a just-in-time scenario. But we're anticipating a pump station will serve Northern Metals, which is in purple, and then the colored shaded areas that you see, kind of the red and the tan colors, are what we were anticipating is the sewer shed or the service area for the first phase of those pump stations. So we're taking into account the area on each side of Hancock Street, Northern Metals, and roughly half of the Sherco 1 site with the phase 1 improvements. And then similarly, when you look to the left on the Sherco 2 site, we're looking at that southern half approximately of the Sherco 2. You'll notice the orange force main from the Sherco 1 pump station for phase 1 is actually going to connect at Liberty Lane, because Northern Metals is going to go online well before any of the Sherco 2 sites, Sherco 1 or Sherco 2 sites develop. We have to have a system in place that will serve Northern Metals. And so from a short-term basis, that force main will connect down at Liberty Lane by Liberty Paper. The third pump station we refer to as the business park lift station, or the main pump station, is what you see in blue. And so this is, the reason I refer to it as the main pump station is ultimately this will receive the wastewater flow from all of the pump stations in the study area. And this will convey wastewater directly to the wastewater plant. So the blue line represents the anticipated alignment of how we would direct the flow directly to the wastewater plant. One step I'll take back, or I'll take a step back here. The existing industrial park, you see the kind of grayish black triangles on the screen. So the existing industrial park now is served by 2 pump stations. The Sherco plant itself has their own pump station, and this all pumps wastewater to an existing 8-inch gravity sewer that crosses Trunk Highway 10. Right? Can you see my cursor on your screen by chance? It doesn't show. Okay, let me.
Is it just to the left of the B in business?
Yes, just a little bit to the left. So I'm going to. How about now? Do you see that? Did the laser pointer show up? Okay. So this is where wastewater presently, for the existing industrial park, all of the wastewater comes through an 8-inch pipe that crosses under Trunk Highway 10 at this location. And the issue for us is that when we look at the capacity needs for the 1,600 acres of undeveloped industrial property, there's not enough capacity in that existing 8-inch pipe to add much more. And so that is why we are looking at another way to convey the wastewater flows from the developing area to the wastewater plant. So I zoomed in a little bit more here in this graphic. This is still phase 1, but trying to show you what is proposed at the Sherco 2 site. So in addition to the pump station that you see in red, there would be the first phase of a trunk gravity sewer. So this is the pipe that's laid on a grade. This is the pipe that actually receives the wastewater from the various industries or businesses, and that conveys the flow to the pump station. So the green lines that you see are the gravity sewers. This is the second part, or the right side of that phase 1 exhibit, zoomed in again. So now you can see we have, it's a little tough to tell on this image, but we would also propose to stub out a 30-inch trunk sewer from the orange pump station, the Sherco 1 pump station. So that will provide future gravity sewer service to Sherco 1 as that develops. The green lines that you see now would be built as part of the frontage road improvements. So those are more typical size sanitary sewers. Those are 8-inch sanitary sewer pipes. And so that is what will provide gravity sewer service to the Northern Meadows site, as well as the property on the east side of Hancock Street, east and north side of Hancock Street. The blue pump station, the main business park pump station, first phase of force main improvements would include a 12-inch pipe that would convey or be connected to the wastewater plant. And then the red force main from the Sherco 2 site is a 10-inch force main. So now we look at what we call phase 2, or the assumption now is more of the Sherco 1 lot develops, more of the Sherco 2 lot develops. What has to happen in order to continue to provide wastewater service? And so when I'm going to zoom in here again. So now on the Sherco 2 site, you'll notice that that green gravity sanitary sewer is extended all the way up to the north end of that site. That is County Road 8 here at the northern boundary. So that 21-inch sanitary sewer would be extended. We would also, there'd be another phase of expansion of that wastewater pump station. So we'd increase the pump sizes, for example, to increase the pumping capacity. On the right side of the graph at the Sherco 1 lot, so now you can see the remainder of that Sherco 1 site would be serviceable. That 30-inch trunk sewer that I referenced earlier would potentially be extended west into the northwest corner. Our objective here is to get gravity sanitary sewer up to the northwest corner of the Sherco 1 lot. At the beginning of the discussion I mentioned, we're taking a liberty as to how that property will develop, whether it'll develop in one 400-acre chunk or whether it might be several smaller chunks. And so the alignment of this green line may look different when the city receives a subdivision plan or a development plan for the Sherco 1 lot. But we have to make some assumptions at this stage. The other thing that would happen in terms of expansion of the Sherco 1 pump station, a second force main or a second pipe would be added to add additional pumping capacity. And that actually, at that point in time, then the assumption is the blue pump station is constructed. We have that available. We would abandon the force main that ties into Liberty Lane, and that orange line now would be directed east to the blue pump station.
So down the road, you'd be adding another line
Another pipe, correct.
alongside of Northern Meadows property.
Correct. Actually, it would likely be on the east side of the frontage road, so on, I'd say more on XL's property at this point versus Northern Meadows.
Wouldn't it make sense to put them both in the ground at the same time? On that particular part of it?
Fair question. The challenge there is having a pipe in the ground that's not used, at least for a long time, sometimes presents concerns about maintaining the integrity of the pipe. It's the capital expense of putting it in now versus later. So we could put the pipe in the ground and not use it. That is certainly an option, but from the standpoint of upfront capital costs and knowing that we've been trying to keep this as manageable as we can, that's the reason why we didn't. But it's a fair question. That's one that we're always having to decide, do you do it now or do you do it later?
When it's not being used, do you stand a chance of anything happening to it?
You know, if it was
Like
filled
collapsing, for example?
No. So there isn't a risk of it collapsing. You know, and with plastic pipe, we haven't seen the same kind of deterioration that we might have seen with some of the older pipes that used to be used, 30 years ago. So one alternative is to keep it full of clean water and then it sits. So that is an option. But
I mean, it's just such a small stretch. I just hate to think of digging it up again.
Well, the one thing I should have mentioned at the beginning, when you look at an image like this, it looks like a short distance.
It's quite a ways.
You look on the other side of Trunk Highway 10 and you see Becker City proper. And so the planning area that we're talking about is almost as large as all of the city of Becker is today. So it is a pretty large footprint, and you kind of lose the scale when we look at drawings like this. So if that's something that the council would like us to entertain some more, it's a fair question.
I'd like to at least know how much more it would cost to put that in the ground now. And then an estimate what it's going to cost in 15 years to do it, how much it's going to cost then.
Fair enough.
So
So
at
we
least
can,
look at it. I'm not saying that's the way to go or anything. It's just,
Ask a follow-up question on that. So typically, when you put pipes in the ground, they have a expected life. Would a pipe that is in the ground but not being used have the same burn, if you want to say, deterioration rate as one that's not? Would you?
you know, if there isn't any chemicals or you know, wastewater sitting in the pipe that could create some other chemical activities that, you know, if it's just clean water, it's unlikely. Now, I'm aware of some instances in the city of St. Cloud where we've put in water main that has not been used, and we're not aware of any, you know, adverse deterioration. So I think the caveat is if it's clean water. Typical life cycle or life expectancy of PVC pipe is 50 years. You know, most cities will depreciate that over up to 20 to 40 years, but we have PVC pipe that's approaching 50 years since it went in the early 70s is when PVC kind of came on the market. And we're not replacing those even on gravity sewers. So I would expect the PVC pipe to have that 50-year life cycle, if not longer.
But would the 50 start when we put it in the ground, or does it start when we start using it, so to speak?
Typically when it's in the ground. Yeah.
Oh.
So I guess in that,
If we waited 15 years, then we would lose 15 years off the life of it, though.
Now the challenge is it could be even longer than 50 years. Like I said, the early 70s is when PVC kind of hit the market and started to be the preferred material. So we don't have anything that's older yet than roughly 50 years. But the joints, the pipe joints are superior to any other pipe. The clay pipes and some of the others that were used in the 60s and 70s. Now, one other thing I should say, you know, when we talk about that second barrel or second pipe going in, it doesn't necessarily mean that it would be an open trench method of installation. And so oftentimes with force mains, we're looking at guided boring or directional boring, so we have much more limited surface disruption. So open cut is an option, but directional drilling is also an option. So
that's expensive.
That's big money.
well, when we start getting into, depending on what the obstructions are, you know, if we've got power poles and other buried utilities, you know, there are times or instances where directional drilling is competitive from an open cut perspective.
No, I understand that it is, but that's typically, though, is more expensive.
Yes, yes, if you're comparing like for like, it generally is on the more expensive side. Any other questions on this slide?
When you go under Highway 10 from a logistical standpoint, is there any disruption to traffic on 10, or is that something you can do pretty much?
If all goes well, typically no disruption. So what the utilities that are under there now and or the railroad typically is a jack steel casing pipe. So we actually have a structurally, it's generally anywhere from ½ inch and thicker underneath the railroad and the highway. The logistical challenge of getting under Highway 10 is it's a long casing. So it's about 300 feet plus or minus to bore underneath the road. And so you might ask, well, what are the typical problems? Hitting a rock is usually the biggest problem. You know, you advance that casing 150 feet and all of a sudden they hit a big rock underneath there, and it's like steering a train. You can't steer it, so you end up abandoning that casing and moving over. So much higher risks when we start dealing with those long of borings, and then they tend to be larger diameter. So the sewer that serves Industrial Park, the industrial service sewer, that's an 18-inch gravity sewer. That's in a, I think it's a 36-inch diameter casing. And so the logic behind that is oftentimes that's the smallest size that the boring contractors will push if they have to send a worker in there to try to dislodge an obstruction. So, so you can imagine a 3-foot diameter pipe getting pushed 300 feet underneath the highway and railroad. That's a logistical challenge. But that is something that both the railroad and MnDOT will require as part of the installation of that pipe. So we're not able to open cut the highway and detour or bypass traffic. So this last slide we refer to as the ultimate improvements, and what you can see that is different now is the northern triangle, if you would, is now accounted for from a flow perspective. The dashed lines represent kind of our sewer sheds, or the breaks of where the gravity sewers would serve those areas. And so two additional pump stations would be added to serve these areas. So we called them Auxiliary Pump Station 1, which is on County Road 53, and then Auxiliary Pump Station number 2, which would be on County Road 8. And so that, in addition to those pump stations, it's a little tougher to see on this scale, but there are 12-inch trunk sewers, the green lines, that would collect flow from the actual properties. Again, this would involve another round of pump upgrades for those existing lift stations, so we'd be increasing the pump capacity in those stations, particularly the Sherco 1, Sherco 2, and the main business park pump station. The next two slides are a summary then of those improvements. We broke them down between phase 1, phase 2, and ultimate. The water supply construction with the asterisk, this just simply acknowledges that we're only looking to account for that first phase of Sherco 2 water supply needs. So we don't know what other businesses will need for water demands, and so we'll have to react to those as those come online. So phase 1, between the hard costs and the soft costs, is estimated to be about $21.9 million. Phase 2, 10.5, and the ultimate phase, 15.5. Those are estimated in 2019 dollars. Obviously, we don't know what point in time phase 2 or the ultimate phase would be built. And so those would have to be reevaluated for cost for inflation when those improvements become necessary. This slide is essentially that you see the same total numbers. We just simply prorated what we call the soft costs. So financing, engineering, those types of items are prorated into the respective categories. And that's my last slide. So if council has questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Otherwise, all the real good narrative stuff is in the report.
You already answered my question. So.
It sounds like we have no questions for you.
Very good. Thank you.
So council, I just need a motion to accept the 2019 Business Park Expansion Feasibility Report. Remember, we are not moving forward. We just need to accept the report that SEH did.
I'll make a motion that we accept the Business Park Feasibility Report from SEH.
Second that.
A motion from Rick, second from Mike. Any other discussion on that? With none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. All right, first quarter financials for 2019. Connie Robinson.
Mayor and Council. So tonight I'm just presenting the first quarter financials. Budget and Finance Committee met in April to review the third quarter financials. And so on your attachment, there's a financial summary. And as of the March 31st, the end of the first quarter, we are below the 25% mark on our expenditures and our revenues, of course. So if there's any questions, I can answer them.
Connie, it appears no one has questions.
All right, thank you.
All right, wastewater treatment facility portable emergency generator replacement with Mr. Lisson.
So I'd like to make a motion then that we untable this. This was tabled from our last meeting, so I make a motion that we untable this resolution 1923.
Second that.
Motion from Rick, second from Mike to untable. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Carried. Go ahead. Thank you, Chris, for bringing this back.
Thank you. So last council meeting, Mr. Cox had some questions about upsizing for a generator from a 45 kilowatt to a 60 kilowatt, and if that would be too big. Had some own experiences of his own where that could be an issue. So I brought those concerns to Lucas Braun, who was the representative from Advanced Power Services, and posed that to him to see what his response would be. I did have a response, which I put in an email that I sent to you. And then I also forwarded that response to an electrical engineer with SCH, Don Carlson, and essentially just to verify to see what Lucas told us was accurate, or he's trying to sell us something. I wanted to verify that that made sense. And after sending that to Mr. Carlson, he looked at it and said that the statements from Mr. Braun were reasonable. So essentially, long story short, if we upsize to the 60 kilowatt generator, ideally manufacturers like to see that generator work between 50% and 80% of capacity. Our largest lift station right now, lift station 15, if that was an emergency situation, running the generator, one pump is running, call for the second one to come on, it would use about 50% of the capacity of that 60 kilowatt generator. So it would be within that range that the manufacturers like to see, right at the bottom end of the range. So the idea of upsizing the 60 kilowatt would give us some room for expansion. So if we have lift station pumps in the business park that are larger, and there are some that are scheduled to be larger, we would have room on our generator to deal with that. So that's the information I have on that. Hopefully that answers the questions. If there's any further questions, I'll try to answer those now.
Are we gonna do anything to try to max that out, to run it at an 80%?
Yes, we can load bank it annually as part of our annual maintenance. So they'll actually run it at capacity, and that'll burn that up. They didn't say we had to do that. Lucas from the Advanced Power Services said you could just run it, do your, what you expect to do for regular maintenance, take it out, run it monthly at the stations. And if you're not experiencing any issues, you wouldn't have to do it, or you can just do it once a year as part of routine maintenance. So you could load bank it. That's a way to deal with it being, running at 50% rather than at 75%, which is their ideal area they'd like to be. Otherwise, if there's other questions.
I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm scared of the tier 4s, that's all I can say.
Okay.
So, I just hope we take the right precautions to make sure we're loading it and.
Yep.
This question is more for Randy, but are the lift station or pump stations that we're going to be doing, are they going to be larger than what we're using now?
This first phase for the Sherco 2, the Northern Meadows site, I think we were looking at 25 horsepower, if I remember correctly, 25 horsepower pumps for this first phase. So ultimately, yes, they will be larger pumps. We are looking at standby power as an option for this first pump station. So there you would actually have a generator at the site that if power were to fail, it would automatically transfer into.
Because it's going to be that critical?
Yes.
Especially the business park lift station. I mean, that would be the main lift station that serves that entire area.
At that point in time, yeah.
Yeah, if you have larger industry that has their own backup power, they're not going to shut down. So for us to have to come in and grab a generator and get out there, that could be interesting. So yeah, especially the business park lift station, we would look to have a standalone so that can automatically transfer over and run without us being there.
So will you be having power plants at all these pump stations or just this one?
Well, not necessarily. So as we grow into it, you will likely want to consider having standby power. And that's not unusual. So cities with their most critical pump stations, if power goes down and you're going to flood a business out, standby power is typically the response. So most main pump stations in communities have standby power.
I would say especially early phases, you'd probably still rely on the portable generator.
Yeah.
As we upsize and go to the, if you get into the second phase, the ultimate phase, then you look at
Adding
adding the
that.
standalone, because you'll know better what kind of industry is moving into that, and we'll know if it's a wet industry, a dry, we'll have a better idea. Or we may know that, well, we don't have to upsize as large as we thought. The portable will work fine for this particular station. Things that, like you said, are kind of fluid depending upon how that whole area develops, so.
Some communities will even go as far as parking their portable generator at that site, knowing that that's the most, likely the most critical one. So, Becker has a lot of pump stations to be mindful of in the event of a power failure. So, it's important equipment to have in your inventory.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is something we think about a lot, especially on that side of Highway 10. That's kind of almost got to be treated as its own entity, especially with industries that will continue to run even if the power is not on. And then lift station 7 on this side of the road is kind of our main station for our domestic. And so we have to balance, that generator can only be in one place at a time. And so you run over, plug it in, go through the procedure, pump station down, then you got to run across Highway 10. Hopefully there's no train, those kind of things, get there in time, pump that station down, I'll come back and do it again. So, kind of treating them as separate entities, and even worker safety involved. People start feeling rushed. This one's alarming, that one's alarming, I got to get going. You start moving too fast, you make bad decisions, you try to push things, that can be a problem too. So I get very concerned about, especially in a business park where you have larger industry, of having us to have to go to 7, pump that down, then run across quick and pump that down, then try to come back and do it again. So I'm always thinking about that. So and we've talked about that a lot with SEH as well. So.
Well, I'm glad you're thinking about that, so I'm not.
Well, it still doesn't sound to me like we need that big of a unit.
He's talking future. For the future, I agree, you're gonna need a bigger one.
Yeah, but if we're gonna be putting on-site generators,
Because right now you're at the,
There,
so what was a 45, where would you be running that then? 75, 80% then, right?
yep, you'd be 45, so it was 42. You'd be running, 85%. So you're getting up there. I mean, I guess in this whole exploration of this, it's the hard thing to kind of account for, because the 45 were kind of towards the top end, and you could probably function, we could probably function there, but you're close. So if you have the opportunity to expand the area you can work in, do we take that step and do that? There are things we can do to maintain it. We can load bank it annually, make sure we're burning that off and not have that issue with it. But if you're at 45 and it all of a sudden for some reason is too small, we upsize 7 because our domestic flows have gotten more and we got bigger pumps, and now we can't run them both together because the generator isn't big enough. I guess I feel like making it bigger now makes sure we have what we need. That's my thought.
I agree with that part, I just would like to see the load bank done, because you're not gonna want this big maintenance bill once this thing does.
Yep.
I just wanted you guys to be aware of it,
Yep.
that's all.
And I think they said it's $400 to $500 a year to do the load bank test, so it's not out of this world to do that.
It's well worth the money.
Yep.
Okay. I'm satisfied.
Okay.
Mike, does that mean you're going to make a motion?
Yes. This resolution 1923?
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Motion, we adopt resolution 1923 for purchasing a generator for a wastewater treatment facility.
Second it?
Motion from Mike, second from Troy. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you, Council. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Administrator and staff reports. Agreement for Rail Service Improvement Grant. Marie Flipson.
Thank you, Mayor. So as you may recall, the city did apply for a rail grant from the Minnesota Department of Transportation. So this was specific to rail. So we applied for the new Northern Metals Recycling spur that will be coming off the main line. and the city was awarded the $1 million towards that project. So tonight before you is Resolution 1926, which would authorize us to sign the agreement with MnDOT, and then the subsequent agreement with Northern Metals. In this project, we're more of a pass-through, so it'll come to the city for that specific project. Otherwise, with any questions, I ask for approval.
I'll make a motion to approve Resolution 1926 to enter an agreement with the Department of Transportation for the Rail Service Improvement Grant for the development of the rail spur to service the new Northern Metals facility.
I'll second it.
Motion from Rick, second from Mike. Any other discussion on it? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Cable franchise agreement. Mr. Przinski.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, City Council. This is actually a carryover from our last meeting. Dave Shops, our Assistant City Attorney, had delivered it earlier in the month, or last meeting in May, I guess it was. So I'm not going to go over this thing in detail. I'll just make a few highlights. So this is a summary of our new cable television franchise agreement with Mid-Continent Communications. As you know, we've had a agreement with them previously. That was a 10-year agreement. General provisions, Section 2. This is a franchise term of 15 years and is non-exclusive. Section 3 goes over construction standards. Section 4, system provisions. Section 5, service provisions. Section 8, operations and administrative provisions. Section 7 talks about remedies for abandonment, foreclosure, and receivership. And Section 8 talks a little bit about additional rights under the agreement. Again, that's a really brief, high overview. I know that we went through it in detail when Mr. Shops was here. I will open up for questions, comments, and then City Council consideration and action.
We spent a lot of time discussing this at our last executive session as well.
I think we came to a conclusion, didn't we?
Well, we had a
agreed on
consensus, I wouldn't
opinions.
say,
Yep,
yeah.
we agreed on opinions.
To me, we don't need to rehash the franchise fee piece, but it was a deal breaker for me, so I will be voting against it based off that.
And I think I viewed it as more of it's a trade for service. They're using our land as a franchise fee, it's a trade for service.
You didn't like it because they're passing it on to the customer. Right?
It's a pass-through, like a pass-through tax, yep.
Tax, really, but there again, too, it's revenue that we count,
Yeah, that or we're gonna have to get it from somewhere else.
so I have no problem with it. Let's go for it.
And those that wish to use the service pay for the fee, so. And we had a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Yep. So that's ordinance
212.
Ordinance 212, second series. I'll make a motion, we approve the cable franchise agreement, ordinance 212, second series.
Second it?
Motion from Mike, second from Troy. Any other discussion? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Carried. Mike, will you make the second motion for publication?
And I'll make a motion for publication of ordinance 212, second series.
I'll second it, sorry.
You can greet it, but you won't publish it, huh?
Give me a break.
Any other
Feel the heat
discussion
of
on
your
the
frustration coming over here. I was getting scared.
all right, all in favor of the second motion for publication?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Opposed? Carried. All right, thank you for that. Consent agenda.
Mayor, City Council, please note, if you would, our consent agenda for May 7th has been revised. Item number 1 is a hiring and termination report from our Public Services Department. Item number 2, and that's the revised part, hiring and termination report for Pebble Creek Golf Club. Item number 3, hiring and termination report for the Becker Community Center. Item number 4, hiring and termination report for our Public Works Department. Item number 5 is hiring and termination report for the Becker Community Center. And item number 6 is our hiring and termination report for the Becker Police Department. Item number 7 is a revision of City Council meeting times, and that's Resolution 1925, and that is moving those meeting times to 5 o'clock for the months of June, July, and August. Sound right? Item number 8, temporary liquor license for the Becker Lions. Number 9 is an agreement for Midwest CAD Solutions. Number 10 is an amendment, number 3, to an antenna site lease agreement with Sprint Spectrum Realty Company LLC. And then item number 4 is for well number 4 control panel, and that's Resolution 19-27. And I think that was out of our SIP budget, capital improvement. So with that, I would open it up to questions. Hopefully I can answer them. Otherwise, a motion to adopt the consent agenda for May 7th would be appreciated.
I just have one thing, is a comment in regards to number 6 on our consent agenda, the retirement of Officer Martin. Just a thank you for his 20 years of service. So he will be retiring. So congratulations on that. Any other questions on the consent agenda? If not, I'll ask for a motion to approve.
Make a motion to approve the consent agenda as presented.
Second it.
Motion from Rick, second from Troy. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes. Payment of the bills.
Motion to pay the bills.
Second it.
Motion from Rick, second from Troy. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. Anniversary announcements for the month of May. Kristen Gagnon, the Administrative Support Specialist in the Police Department, is celebrating her first year. That went super fast, did it not? Wow. And then Officer Tim Martin from the Police Department, he is celebrating his 20 years in the month of May. So congratulations to them. Does council have anything else for the betterment of Becker? If not, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn. Second it.
Motion from Mike, second from Rick. All in favor?
Aye.
We are adjourned at 7:08.